Welcome to the third in our series of summer salons. Use the term summer rather advisedly as I watch the fog roll across the hill just now. It's going to be chilly going home and probably wet.
San Francisco summer.
Indeed. But delighted to have you all here and delighted to be here. I will start with the microphone. This is the commencement of our formal program. And I'm delighted to have Steve Wasserman here. Steve is the author. Stephen, what would you prefer?
Steve is fine.
Steve is fine, okay.
We're friends. Steve is fine.
Okay. I'm slow to word. Just, okay. So Steve is the author of Grasping at Straws, Letters from the Holocaust, copies of which are for sale in back in both hardcover and paper bound. You are, if I remember correctly, retired attorney.
Yes.
Yes. Speak directly to the microphone.
Into the microphone.
What area of law did you specialize in?
I was a litigator, business litigation.
Business litigation. I'm just going to play idiot here. What does that mean?
Basically, a trial attorney handling disputes that are business related as opposed to, say, medical malpractice or divorce or family matters, that type of thing.
So, my business sues your business. I
Correct.
call you to represent me in said dispute.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So then the logical question is, and that leads you to take up writing in your retirement in what way?
Well, and first of all, the setting kind of reminds me of Between Two Ferns, and you're my Zach Galifianakis today, but I kind of feel like maybe we should change the name to Between Two Toras and get some appropriate decorations.
We originally had those plastic plants out here, and I said to Corey, I'm like, oh, I'm going to make Between Two Ferns jokes. You beat me to the punch.
Sorry. I didn't
Good job. No, very good.
Didn't mean to steal your thunder there. So the way I got into this project, because I didn't start out planning to write a book. When I was in either high school or college, my mother gave me a little spiral-bound set of letters that she had translated from letters from my great-grandparents and various of their friends and extended family in Germany. And the letters were written by people who, by and large, did not get out. Some of the letters were written by family members and family friends in Germany who did escape, but many did not. And as you might imagine, the letters were really moving, just so full of emotion and hope and despair and courage. So I read the letters in high school or college, wherever it was, and they were very interesting, but I didn't do anything with them. But they were sort of in the back of my mind over the years, and then about 6 years ago, when I was approaching retirement, I decided to take another look at them. And my idea at the beginning was I just wanted to write up our family history so that our children, Allison and Josh, would know where my mom's side of the family came from and what they had gone through. So I took another look at the letters, and my sister and my aunt still had a bunch of the original letters. Now, one of the problems with the translations that my mother had done was she only translated those portions that she thought were important. And I wanted to tell a more full story about what their lives were like. This was in Cologne, Germany. So the first thing I had to do was hire a translator because I do not speak German, I don't read German, I could not make heads or tails out of most of the letters because they were written in cursive, they were written on onion skin paper, some of them were faded, so it would have been virtually impossible for me to translate on my own. So I hired a translator to help me get complete copies of the letters. And I started to write the story of my grandparents and how they got out, as well as the story of my great-grandparents, my granduncle, and other family members and their friends who did not get out. Well, as I started to read these letters, I realized that the stories of these other families were equally compelling to that of my own. And some of them don't have any, they don't have family of their own. Their line ended in the Holocaust. And I began to feel like it was important that someone speak for these people, that somebody remember them, tell their stories, honor their suffering, and make sure that they weren't forgotten. So as I began to write about 5 families instead of just one, the book got longer, the manuscript got longer. And then I eventually decided that I didn't want to just tell the stories as related in the letters. Yes, everybody knows some World War II history, everybody knows some Holocaust history, but I thought it would be useful to include the actual history of the Holocaust, World War II. Actually, I started World War I to provide the context for what ultimately led to World War II and the Holocaust, so that readers would have context for what was happening to the family at various points in time. So that also made the manuscript grow and grow until eventually it was book length. So that's how I came to the project. That's what my motivation initially was, then how my motivation changed and grew over time until I eventually ended up with what we have here, which is much more than I started out thinking I was going to write. One more thing, I was really lucky because even though my grandparents, my mother and my aunt got out in January 1939 when things were really bad, they were able to ship a lot of stuff with them. And so I have probably 15 family albums with photographs of everyone. Now, like many family albums, the names of the people aren't on the pages, and so that made it a bit of a challenge. But I have my grandmother's and grandfather's diplomas from universities they attended in Germany. I have a couple of my mother's workbooks when she was in 3rd and 4th grade in Cologne. I have passenger manifests from Volendam, the ship that they took from Southampton to New York. So I have all this wonderful documentary material, as well as photographs that I could use, and many of which I've included in the book to try to bring the characters to life, if you will.
And at some point did you, I don't know if you did this, travel to Germany to, delve into the archives there, or at least, walk the streets?
Well, the plan was to do just that, but
Does this end with, and then 2020 happened?
Yeah, and then 2020 happened. So we planned the trip, then COVID happened. Then we planned the trip for the next year, then COVID came back or never went away. Couldn't go. Finally, we went earlier this year. But there were some, and I say this in full recognition that I am no spring chicken, but there are some elderly people who I wanted to have the opportunity to read my manuscript and ultimately my book. And so I finally decided, I can't wait. I don't know when COVID is going to end. I want to finish the book so that people can read it. So unfortunately, I wrapped it up without having visited. It was fabulous going to Cologne. Miraculously, the family home was not destroyed. Cologne was the site of the first Allied 1,000-bomber raid, and much of the city was flattened and just completely devastated. But their house and a few homes around it were not destroyed, so we were actually able to see the building where my mom lived before they fled. We took a walk one day, Sharon and our 2 kids and I, in the nearby park, the Stadtwald, where my mom used to go play. And back in the day, they had herds of tame fallow deer that were wandering around the park. Well, the descendants of the deer are still there, and so we were able to go and walk through the little petting zoo and see these deer and walk along the ponds, of which I have pictures with my mom and my aunt riding their scooters along the edge of the pond. So it was a very rich experience, albeit too late to be included in the book. We also were able to see the Stolperstein. some of you probably know what these are, but Stolperstein is German for stumblestone. And a gentleman started a project whereby he puts cobblestones in the street, in the sidewalk, in front of the last place where a Holocaust victim voluntarily lived. And then on top of the cobblestone, he puts a brass plaque with the name of the person, their date of birth, the date of their death, and what happened to them. So it will say whether they were liberated, or whether they were murdered, or whether they fled, that sort of thing. So we were able to not only see the stones for my family, but for some of the other people about who I've written.
And are there any remnants of your family left in Europe, or
No.
two? So yeah, I mean, so my father's family, there was also, and we don't have the letters, but there was that same desperation of trying in the 30s to get people out, because and people used to go back and forth, which was fascinating to me to learn, and I don't know if this was true in your family, but that people would come to America and they would try it out, and maybe it worked or maybe it didn't, and then they would go back to Europe, or come back again. And in the 20s and the 30s, that probably seemed like a reasonable proposition. But as things got worse and worse in Germany, it was A, less possible to do, and B, the level of desperation to get out increased year over year.
Right, and one other thing that was really very rewarding was there were a couple of people there who I've worked with for the past 5 years. There's a professor who has done a lot of research about economic crimes during the National Socialist regime, and so he and I have corresponded and shared documents. There's a wonderful fellow who works at the National Socialist Documentation Center in Cologne, Ibrahim Imsala, and Ibrahim is just a fabulous
It's a
guy.
good Ashkenazi name. I don't understand why they chuckle.
And so we've corresponded for years, and I was able to meet both of them and spend time with them. They went out with us to the family, to the homestead and all. So there were a lot of things that came together to make it a really rich experience. I can say that having been there, I'm not going back. I can't do it. It's too hard.
Just emotionally.
Yes, I
Yeah.
don't want to go back to the literal scene of the crime.
Right.
I've been there, I've seen it, I'm done.
Yeah.
But it was important to go one time to get the visual information, if you will.
Right. So I guess that sort of brings up the question: as you're going through this archival material, do you find yourself screaming at the page? Right, like, you idiot, get on the boat now. I mean, like, was that a thought, or you were like, you already knew how the story ended, and therefore you didn't find yourself there?
So I never screamed at the page, and I never second-guessed my grandparents for staying as long as they did. There were plenty of times where I had to push back from the table and take a break, because it was just too sad. Knowing what was happening to these people and some of the decisions that they had to make, and some of the families here, the decisions that they were faced with, trying to save themselves and their children, and what they had to do, and what they faced, was extraordinary. So I wasn't angry or frustrated with them. It was interesting. I read one book, and the author wrote that women generally were more ready to leave than men. For men, it was more difficult because at the time, the men were the breadwinners, and for them, it was a much more daunting prospect to go someplace new and try to start over and make a living and support their families. And a lot of them thought that the regime wouldn't last, right? That this is a phase, that it will pass. And I actually just thought to myself the other day, considering this very question you asked, why didn't they leave? And frankly, I'm sure there are some of us who have thought that question now about our own country. Things being as bad as they are. We probably all know maybe one or two people who have thought about getting dual passports getting citizenship somewhere else, just in case. So, but we aren't leaving because this can't, well, speaking for myself, this madness that we've been going through the last 4, 5, 6 years, well, it can't last, right? It's got to end and the country will get back to normal. Well, hopefully and probably, but not always. So seeing that sort of historical parallel or kind of echo for me, again, takes away any sort of second guessing or anger or lapel shaking that I might otherwise have felt.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring up that notion of the challenge of emigration, and as somebody who has emigrated, and I don't know what the word is when you come back home, so like I moved to a foreign country and, my children were born there, but I have a tremendous amount, I've got the experience of tremendous amount of compassion and respect for my great-grandparents and, in some cases further back, who came to the United States in the age before jet travel, before the internet, before reliable mail service, to a land where they didn't speak the language, they didn't necessarily have a good landing pad. It's hard. Like, landing someplace, especially as an adult, that's really, really hard. And you set yourself up to be economically disadvantaged pretty much forever.
Well, right, and in Germany, so at the time you could convert your German marks to another currency, but you had to pay a 90% penalty. So you only got 90% of the value. And there was the forced Aryanization program where Jews had to sell their businesses and then they had to sell their homes. And they got little, if anything. For example, my family sold their home, but the purchase price was never paid. So you're looking at going to another country with very little. Now, they were fortunate and they were able to make their way when they got here, subject to tragedy that ensued only 2 years after they arrived. But that too made it really hard. My family, so they got out in January of 1939. They had to wait a year for their US visa number to come up. So what were they going to do? They weren't going to stay in Germany. They were able to get what was called a transit visa to go to England. So the British were willing to let at least these Jews in as long as they didn't stay. And it was astonishing, some of the reading I did, because there were members of the British government that talked openly about how we don't want to let too many Jews in because we don't want to have our own Jewish problem. Oh my God. And members of our own State Department made the same kind of comments. So anyway, so my family went to England and they stayed there for a year until their US visa number came up, and then they came to the United States. Now my grandfather was a physician, so he studied for the entire year they were in England, trying to get his English to the point where he could take the medical boards once they got here, so that he could then try to make a living and support the family. My mom was 11, my aunt was 9. So they went from going to school in Germany to going to a Catholic school in England for a year, to then coming to the United States, emigrating to Cincinnati, starting in the school in Cincinnati for a couple of months, and then once my grandfather found a town where he felt it would be a good place to set up a practice, going to another school. So you have these 9 and 10-year-old girls who over the course of 1 year lived in 3 countries and went to 4 schools. And the same thing with their parents, trying to keep their spirits up and the family moving forward despite all this uncertainty. Now this is all going on at the same time that they're getting these heartbreaking letters from my great-grandparents who could not get out. And you read these letters and they oscillate between incredible bravery, where the great-grandparents are saying, let me back up. So Jews were allowed to live in their homes for a while. Then as the bombing began and a lot of the housing stock in Cologne was destroyed, the municipal government booted Jews out of their homes, moved them into what were called Jew homes, and let Aryans move into the still standing Jewish homes.
And what year is this? Just
41.
oh, okay. So this is already this is post the invasion of France. This is really
Right.
the war is underway.
Yes, and mail service ended in December of 1941 once the United States entered the war. So the letters go from 1938 to 1941, and then there are a couple of post-war letters, including one extraordinary letter from my great uncle who survived Auschwitz. So, oh, right. So, so they were getting these letters from their parents who were still there, putting on a brave face about, well, yes, we're out of the family home, we're living in a room, we cook on a hot plate, but we make the best of it. We pretend like we're living in a hotel for an extended stay, where all you have is one room to live in. But it's okay, and we go out for walks until it became too dangerous and unpleasant for Jews to walk the streets. So on one hand, you've got the incredible bravery of those behind trying to put on a strong face, and at the same time saying, please do anything you can to help us. What can we do? How can we find sponsors? Where can we get the money? So my grandparents were trying to make their way and care for their children while at the same time dealing with this incredible emotional trauma of how can they save their parents, as well as the many other family members who are writing to them and asking for help.
Yeah, no, I mean it's truly a refugee situation, and there's no. I mean, I can't help but think back to my own experience, which is not comparable. But as an immigrant, I always knew in the back of my head, well, if this just doesn't work, I'll go home, right? But there is no home, right? This is it, sink or swim. We layer in raising children into that, and dealing with, the uncertainty of your extended family. I don't know to what degree the letters, back in the other direction, or any of the correspondence betrays a sense of frustration or helplessness in that regard. Because I'm sure that was just an awful experience for your grandparents.
Yes, and to your point that you asked a couple of minutes ago about, did I get angry? I do have one letter that I quoted in its entirety from a Dr. Zadeh. He was a colleague of my grandfather's. And he wrote to my grandparents once they got to the United States asking for help, trying to find sponsors to get him, his wife, and their adult daughter out. And he starts out the letter by saying, look, our family has lived here for generations. I can't be angry with them because they regard this country as their country, as do I. And they had no reason to leave. And so how can I be angry that we are here now and find ourselves in this situation? So it speaks a little bit to why some people stay, why they stay.
And it almost makes me think of the sort of the longer historical context of Jews in Germany and Jews in Europe, for that matter, right? We're not from there, in as much as there's 1,000 years of history plus, in Ashkenaz, right? But during the course of that, you allude to this in the beginning of the book about, at what point Cologne allowed Jews to be living in Cologne or not, or they to live just outside of town, and how far out of town, what have you. Do you have any insight to, that awareness permeated some of the thinking of folks who are oh, okay, here we are again, it's the Crusades all over again?
Certainly, Jews had a checkered and difficult history in Germany. The National Socialists were not cut from whole cloth.
Right, yeah, they come ex nihilo, right.
But again, to the point about, well, so why didn't they leave? There was a saying among German Jews at the time, there are two kinds of countries in the world. Countries where Jews can't live, and countries where Jews can't get in. In other words, countries where they couldn't live because it was horrible to live there, like Germany, but then there wasn't any place for them to go. And there was almost no country in the world that was willing to take Jews. Shanghai took some, Ecuador took some. One of the families I wrote about emigrated to Ecuador. Now, if you can imagine going from urban, sophisticated Western Europe to a rural, in some respects, undeveloped or underdeveloped tropical country, and think about what it took to build a new life there.
Right.
But there were almost no safe havens.
Right, Rabbi Brown's mother's family ended up in South America.
Oh.
And that, right, and I know there were families that ended up in Cuba. You know, the Cuban Jewish community and the Jewish community in Mexico City largely was populated with people who, by hook or by crook, managed to get out of Europe in the 30s.
Well, and there were a lot of people who wanted to go to Cuba as one of the last places of refuge, but getting to Cuba was incredibly expensive. It was also virtually impossible, eventually, to go anywhere. You had to be able to get from Germany to a port of call. And once you got to the port of call, to get a visa, you had to show that you had a guaranteed space on a ship. Well, you couldn't get the shipping lines to commit to give you a guaranteed space. And some shipping lines resold the seats over and over. And that assumes that you have the money to pay for the ticket once you got there, or the money to support yourself in Lisbon, for example, which was one of the few remaining ports from which ships were sailing once the war began, to sustain yourself if you had to wait for another ship to come. So the hurdles...
Well, and just to get to Lisbon, I mean, you'd have to get across France, across Spain, right? You know, and Spain and Portugal were ostensibly neutral during the war, but those were heavily fortified borders, you know, based on my recollections. Like, you couldn't just waltz across them.
Right, so it was extraordinarily difficult, even if you had the wherewithal and the desire to go, to try to get to some place from which you could leave. It was so frustrating to read the letters that my uncle, for example, sent about what he was doing day after day, going to the consulate, going to this office, writing to the shipping lines, writing to the U.S. refugee committees, writing to the Jewish committee in Germany, trying to get place berths on ships, trying to get visas. So many people tried so hard. You just have to, respect their efforts and what they did, and the fact that they had the courage, most of them, to get up every day and keep going. Now, a number of Jews committed suicide as a means of taking control of their own lives. And I respect that. It was an act of self-determination. But for those who didn't, to be able to get up day after day in these horrible conditions where they were afraid to go out on the street. They weren't allowed to go to plays or shows. They could only go shopping for an hour a day at 4 in the afternoon when the store shelves were all empty anyway. But to be able to function and act with purpose, even if with only limited effect, I think was extraordinary. Because you sometimes you try to put yourself in their position, and you think, well, what would I do? Would I be able to get up and continue, or would I just curl up in a ball on the floor and wait for the end? I mean, it's hard to say, but most of these people were extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's I think one of these things where, as history repeats itself, I think we saw this with the Syrian refugee crisis. There was a lot of these same kind of conversations, like, oh, well, how many of these people do we want? Like, then we'll have a problem. We'll have all these people. And the language is so eerily similar.
to the conversations that were happening in this country in the 30s, and just, awful, in their callousness.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's very difficult to see.
Yeah, I mean, so as part of your research, were you also trying to understand the contemporaneous situation in America? Because, amply documented sort of the political calculus that Roosevelt either engaged in or he was just, indifferent to the plight of European Jews. But, there was a lot of that as well.
So, you mentioned Roosevelt. So there was a bill that was drafted by two senators, and I don't remember their names, but it was a Republican and a Democrat. I wrote about it in the book, but I can't remember everything that I wrote.
It's a big book.
Yes, it's a big book.
And even after you discount the photographs, which are really interesting.
But they drafted a bill to admit 20,000 Jewish children. The bill never came up for a vote in the Senate, and Roosevelt never took a position on the bill. The St. Louis, which probably we're all familiar with, the United States didn't allow it to dock here. 1,500 passengers. Would 1,500 people have destroyed the fabric, the historical stream of our populace if we had let those 1,500 people in? Just maddening.
It's one of those moments where you're reminded that much of what animated the National Socialists was, brought down by Henry Ford. It's a particularly American strain of thought that, if you had asked me in the 90s, has this gone away? I would have said largely, and here we are 30 years later. I'm like, no, apparently not.
Well, and another historical parallel, Hitler justified his initial aggression by saying, well, I'm moving into these territories to protect Germans from being persecuted. So first he needed to go into the Rhineland, then the Sudetenland, then the Anschluss and take over Austria because Germans who are living in those countries were being mistreated, which is Putin's playbook to the letter. Just astonishing. So there's a lot of very sad history in here that we are seeing horrific echoes of now. And you think these things can happen again. Who would have ever thought that we'd see a major land war again in Europe? And yet we are, because of one madman.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's challenging and it's troubling. So what I found interesting about your book is I don't want to call it a corrective, but it's a perspective that we often skip over, the perspective of Jews in Germany, especially in Western Germany. Typically when we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about Poland, we talk about the Ukraine, we talk about, the Pale of Settlement, and that sort of takes up a lot of our mental space. But for, German citizens, Jewish Germans, it gets started earlier, and arguably was, more drawn out and probably therefore more torturous to some degree.
Well, and 100,000 Jewish men served in the German army in World War I. 10,000 were killed. My grandfather and both of his brothers served in the German army in World War I. They all were awarded the Iron Cross. One of them died 1 month before the war ended. And in fact, one of the incredible things that I had to work with was my grandfather kept a handwritten diary during the 4 years he served in the German army during World War I. Beautifully written in this lovely cursive script with hand-drawn maps of all of the battlefields. So you have people who these Jews thought this was their country.
And they were patriots.
Yes. And so how could it be that things would get to the point they did even before the onset of the final solution, let alone the final solution.
Right.
Who would think such a thing?
And is there in the course of the letters that you see like a dawning realization, you know, where it goes from, you know, we all talk about the metaphor of the frog, and turn the water up slowly, right? Is there a point where everybody's sort of like, oh yeah, this is at a full boil?
Yes, Kristallnacht. That was the inflection point. And so my grandmother knew early on that they were going to have to get out. So she hired an English au pair because she was convinced they could not stay on the continent, that it just wouldn't be safe to be on the continent. She thought they needed to go to an English-speaking country. So she hired an English au pair so that they would all know the language when the time came to flee. So she was ready to go much sooner than my grandfather. Well, comes Kristallnacht, and as you'll read either in the introduction or if you go to the little website I set up for the book, the excerpt, my grandfather was arrested the morning after Kristallnacht and sent to Dachau. And that was sort of the final straw. He realized in the summer of '38, when the regime finally forbid all Jewish physicians from practicing, that they had to go because there was no way for him to make a living in Germany anymore. So at that point, he knew they needed to leave. He started to smuggle currency into Holland and leave it with cousins there so that they would have some money if and when they had to leave. But they still had to apply for visas and wait for their number to come up. And then when Kristallnacht came and he was arrested, that really lit the fire, not only under them, but everyone else. Life was full of serendipity. I mean, a couple of examples. So my grandfather was a doctor. One of his patients was the U.S. Consul General in Cologne. So after my grandfather was arrested and sent to Dachau, my grandmother went to the consul and said, look, you got to help me. You have to help me get my husband out, which he did. So pure serendipity that A, he was a doctor, B, the consul was his patient. So
Sympathetic.
yes, and sympathetic. And just a side note on sort of how the research process can go. All I knew about the consul was his name. So I went online and I searched for and found an obituary for him. In the obituary, it said what his hometown was. So I found an online telephone directory for his hometown. And I just started calling everybody by the same last name, asking whether or not they were related to this gentleman. Well, finally, I found someone who was related to him, who gave me the name and contact information for his granddaughter who lives in Washington, D.C., who I called, and we become fast friends, and shared a tremendous amount of information about. So
Tell me she works for the State Department, and we'll close the circle.
yeah, actually, she worked for the EPA.
It's close.
But, so it's just fascinating the way you can try to track people down. So there was that bit of serendipity. When they finally left England, they sailed on the Volendam from Southampton to New York. 1 month after they sailed on the Volendam was making another trip to the United States. And it had a number of British children on board because the British were evacuating a lot of their children to the United States and Canada for the duration of the war. The ship was torpedoed by a U-boat. It didn't sink, but everybody abandoned ship. All the passengers were safe except for one crewman who fell overboard and died. So the ship, the people in the lifeboats were rescued. They were taken back to England. The Volendam was towed and then beached so it could be repaired on the southwestern coast of England. 1 month after that, many of those same children were put on a ship by the name of the Benares. The Benares was sailing to the United States, again, to get these children and others out of harm's way. The ship was torpedoed by a U-boat and sank with a tremendous loss of life, including, I think it was 165 British children, which led to the end of the effort to evacuate British children from England. They stayed in the UK for the duration of the war. But the serendipity is, well, okay, which ship were you on and at what time? And my mom wrote a letter to their the family they stayed with in England, while she was on the Volendam. And she drew a picture of the ship and wrote about how they saw a convoy of destroyers sailing alongside them for a while. There's so much luck involved in life. Which boat were you on? Which day did you sail? When it was hit, did it sink? When it went back, were you under a lucky star or were you cursed? There's a lot of things like that that also gave me pause about how little control you have over your life at times, and how much luck is involved with how you turn out, literally whether you live or not.
Yeah, it reminds me of the old adage, you know, the trick is to pick good parents.
Don't ask my children how they feel about
Yeah,
that.
right.
It may depend on what day you ask
Right,
them.
I believe that particular line comes, there's a guy who's an ultra runner and somebody's like, what makes you so successful? He's like, the trick is to pick really good
Yeah,
parents.
you gotta have good genes for that.
Yeah. So I know you wanted to read an excerpt for us, and I'm just, I'm surreptitiously looking at the clock, and I don't want to.
Yeah, I'll just read a couple of short things, and then I will leave time if people have parents. So this is a letter, not from one of my family members, but I came upon in my research. And it goes to the issue of, for lack of a better way of putting it, survivor's guilt. This is a woman who had a way to get out, but couldn't take her mother with her. So now came, and then,
Can you hold the mic closer?
yeah, I'm sorry. Now, it's not,
It should be on, yeah.
is it on?
Yeah.
Is that good?
They're just very sensitive. You just really have to hold them close.
Okay. Now came an unspeakably difficult day. The day we had to bid farewell to my mother. How terrible, how ghastly to leave this 74-year-old woman behind in a country that offered no security. My mother had enough to live on, but for how much longer? And I, her only child, was about to leave her. She had lost her other two children through death. Her son was killed in the war, and the daughter died at a young age, and now I was leaving her too. It was a fate that cried out to heaven. Now, this is a letter, this next letter that I'm going to read is from Hildy Spire. She was a close family friend. So her husband and their two children fled to Belgium, which was not far enough. And when the Nazis invaded Belgium, they arrested Mr. Spire, sent him to an internment camp in southern France. Mrs. Spire and the children went to be with him, and they eventually were all interned. And so she wrote to my grandparents, I personally have no hope in this matter anymore. I'm so tired of the battle, and only the desperate thoughts of the children pull me back to reality. I worry about Carl's physical condition. The only thing he's able to do is lie down, but it is impossible to keep him nourished as he ought to be. You can imagine how worrisome this is. And now I congratulate you on your exemplary children. It must be a real pleasure to be with them. About ours, Carl already wrote to you. Here, there's no use to have either talent or industry. Everything one wanted to spare them, now they must endure doubly, and one must be silent and watch. I can't write anymore. Trude, you know how very grateful I am for all your efforts. I wish you continued success with all my heart, for you and yours, with best regards to all, and a kiss for you. When you talk about courage, and I don't want to, that family, those parents had to make a decision about how to go about saving their children. Heartbreaking doesn't begin to describe it. Then from my great-grandmother, you don't have to say you're sorry for not being able to do anything for us at this time. It's a question of money, and you over there are not Midas. It's not possible for us to go via Cuba, because Cuba was very expensive. We have to be patient like so many parents and wait until the war is over, which will be the case one of these days. If we stay healthy until that date, then hopefully nothing will interfere with our being united. That was August 17, 1941, so 4 months before my service ended. Anyways, that gives you a feel for some of these letters. Those are the times where I had to push back from the table and just take a break.
So the psychic toll obviously is considerable. How long was this project in total for you?
So I worked on it for 5 years. Now, I didn't work on it all day, every day. I worked on it 3 days a week, 5 days a week, some days 2 hours, some days 4 or 5 hours. But as I explained earlier, it grew substantially over time as I discovered more stories and more sources. So I sort of took my time to try to do the best job I could. So it was a long project.
Yeah, no, it's truly amazing that all that material was able to cross the ocean, given, so many other, you think, okay, I got me and I got the hair on my head and that's enough. And for them to have moved all this material with them is really amazing.
Yeah, it's astonishing.
And A, that they decided to do it, and B, that they could do it. Given everything else you're telling me about the cost and a year plus transit time, it just really amazes me.
And that my mother or my aunt or my sister didn't throw it out at some time over the past 40, 50, 60 years. Or that the letters, even on that thin onion skin paper, are still intact. I mean, it's nothing short of miraculous. That it's all there.
Well, I mean, that is, so my graduate training was in history, not law. But, there's an awareness when you study history that you only know that which is preserved, and everything else is lost. And you through conjecture and theory, you can try and reconstruct it. But when it's gone, it's gone. So you have this partial picture of the past. And you're just so fortunate to have such a fully fleshed out picture of your family's past. I know in my family, like almost none of that. It's just lore that was handed down. Really, the documentation is long gone.
Anybody have a question? In case we're getting
Mr.
Let me
Prince.
pull out a microphone.
Oh, we'll pull out a microphone for you. So you'll wait a moment for the usher to bring you a
For the viewers at home.
Steve, what was the impact? What was the impact of all of this on your mother in the United States and on you growing up? And how might this book have changed some of the way you looked at this family story?
My mother never talked about it. Never talked about any of this, nor did my grandmother. It just was never a topic of conversation. I did interview my mother probably about 20 years ago, but she only shared a limited amount of information. My grandmother had already passed away, so I never had the opportunity to talk to her about it. So, I didn't focus on it enough. I didn't realize how important this material was, such that I would have pursued it back when my mother was still alive and still had a substantial amount of her memory. I think the biggest way that it would have changed how I felt about them was the amount of respect I would have had for their courage and their strength. The things that they had to deal with. I'll give you one spoiler, what the heck. So they got to the United States 2 years after they got here. My mother, her sister, my grandparents. My grandfather came down with leukemia and died. So he escaped, he got out of Dachau, got the family out of Germany, was lucky enough to be on a ship that didn't get torpedoed, got to the United States, passed the medical boards, settled in Cincinnati, bought a home, and died. And there's my grandmother with 2 girls, ages 13 and 11, in a foreign country with no support system, having to figure out how do we go forward. If I had known all of this, would have, I think, figuratively tipped my hat to them every day because what they went through was incredible. And they then went forward to live full, rich, happy lives, notwithstanding everything that they had been through. So I would have had so much more perspective about the kind of people they were. That's the biggest difference it would have made.
Yeah.
Joanne?
I actually have 2 questions.
Okay, we'll get the microphone to you and then.
2 questions to follow up on David's a little bit. Given what your mother went through, even if she didn't really share it with you, do you think it affected how she was a parent?
Only in one respect. So, when
that
we
was
were-
the mark of a careful answer being plotted that.
So, the way that the trauma of the war and what have you, I don't think affected her as a parent. But when they were, in the couple of years when my grandmother was thinking they had to leave, she had them going to all kinds of classes so that dance and music and English and this and that, so they would be as well-rounded and as well prepared for new life as they could be. And for my mother, the pendulum swung the other way. She didn't have us do anything when we were kids, no classes of any kind at all. The biggest impact it had on my mother, that I can tell, is that she was a believer in helping those in need. And so she was very involved in resettling Russian Jewish refugees and resettling Vietnamese refugees, and as a supporter of Israel Bonds and JNF. So she took what happened to her and in a sense made it a big part of her mission in life, if you will, if that's responsive.
The other question, completely different. I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, but did you say that there was a period, 39 to 42, where the mail was working, and then there was a period when it was stopped or blocked? The postage wasn't the...
Yes, so as of December 7, 1941, once the United States entered the war, there was no longer any mail service between the United States and Germany. And in fact, I have a 3-page letter that my grandmother wrote to my grandparents after my grandfather died, telling them what she was doing to try to keep the family afloat. Well, the only reason I have that letter is because it was returned as undeliverable, because there was no longer any mail service. So from December 1941 until after the war, my grandmother had no idea what was happening with her family that was still there. She didn't know what had happened to her mother or my granduncle, whether they were alive, whether they were dead, where they had ended up, anything like that. And unfortunately, after the war, the Red Cross and other organizations that were trying to help reunite people made mistakes. And they saw people's names on various rosters as survivors, but they were not. They had not survived. And so so there was this 4-year period where you really didn't know anything about what was going on with your family, unless by some miracle somebody managed to get word out. And that too, what a difficult thing. How you get up every day and go about your daily life, doing the laundry, making dinner for the kids, going downtown to be a seamstress, which my grandmother did to try to make a living. My aunt was working at a fruit farm picking berries for 2 cents a quart. How do you do that, knowing in the back of your mind that your mother, your brother-in-law, and other family members are out there going through who knows what? I marvel when I think about what these people have to deal with. Did that answer your question, Joanne?
Yeah, and all the more so, I think we take for granted at some level the flow of information around the globe these days. You know, and they email and, you know, texting and what have you. But, you know, back then, you had letters and maybe a telegram, and that was pretty much it. And in the wake of a war like that, you know, and this is how you read these stories of people, you know, reunited after, you know, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, you know, oh, I thought you died in the war. They didn't know, and there was no way to, you know, there was no like, oh, let's meet again at the corner of, you know, 5th and, you know, Van Ness.
Right, and well, and you can have a couple of, eventually people were able to send messages through the Red Cross, at least some people were. You were limited to, well, I think it was 2 lines, basically.
But you'd have to know where to send it.
Yeah, well, you have to know where to send it, and then you got a telegram from people telling you that they're leaving tomorrow for Theresienstadt. What do you do with that? Because everybody knew that if you didn't die in Theresienstadt, it was nothing more than a way station. And eventually, everybody knew what was happening. So again, these incredible documents that have survived all these years, but the horrible stories that they tell. I don't know, I just find it all amazing what people dealt with. Anybody else?
Mr. Nim?
Actually, the story that you suggested happened to my grandmother. She had come to the United States in the 20s. She had come here in the 20s, leaving her family behind. She was sending money back so that they could come over, but of course they didn't do that. They put it to the family business, and she thought they had all been killed. And 20 years after the war, she gets a phone call, Regina, it's Avram, your brother. So it happened.
Yeah.
And my parents were able to visit him in Belgium. He had remarried to a woman who was also a survivor. And they had a family, and he apparently kept a closet with all of his camp memorabilia in it. So he never forgot.
Wow. Other questions?
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank
Yeah.
you for taking time to share my family's story.
Well, thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you for the work you put into this. Clearly a work of love and work of pain. And, you know, remarkable that you stuck with it. Because I can imagine there were many moments where you might have said, this is too much. And, you know, this can wait.
Well, I'm happy that I've told these people's stories, and that in some fashion, whether this book is on a library shelf, whether it's at Yad Vashem or the Holocaust Museum in Washington, or the Library of Congress, where I've sent copies, those people will be remembered. Their stories haven't died. That was important. So, in that respect, mission accomplished.
Congratulations.
Okay, thanks again.
Okay, shameless plug. Copies are available in the back of the room. Come on, be a good capitalist. I understand the author will inscribe them to you if you prefer. So thank you again so much. And thank you all for coming. Next week, Susan Borkin is going to talk about memoir writing and its therapeutic aspects. I will again be your absolutely inept host, but I do hope you will all join us, and maybe there'll be a little sunshine. So thank you.
Thanks.